Earn the respect of your peers with Atari Archive's look at Haunted House. "1982 features quite a few seminal works by Atari for the VCS, and we start that line off with Haunted House. This was the company's second release for the year, technically speaking, as Super Breakout's Sears exclusivity expired in January, but it eschews converting a coin-op title into a home version in favor of something a bit more expansive. In effect, Haunted House stands as the spiritual successor to Superman and Adventure, the video game duo that introduced new complexities, storytelling, and visual design to home video games, and were well regarded for it. As a quick overview of those two games, both Adventure and Superman were developed from the same proof-of-concept prototype for a multi-screen adventure game put together by Warren Robinett after he finished Slot Racers in 1978. Superman, by Dunn, emphasized in-game storytelling, speedrunning, and both oral and graphical fidelity, while Adventure, completed by Robinett, focused on exploration, item management, and overcoming bespoke obstacles such as locked doors. No VCS games between Adventure's March 1980 release and Haunted House's February 1982 appearance revisit those ideas, but Haunted House marries these important aspects of both of its forebears into one package that holds together remarkably well. This game comes to us from James Andreasen, and it is his sole known Atari VCS program before he moved over to developing games for the Atari 5200 game system. Unfortunately for us, Andreasen passed away of cancer in 2002, with no recorded interviews or convention appearances to speak of, so there is simply very little to go on regarding Haunted House's actual development. We can glean a few things from a work-in-progress beta of the game and some other materials surrounding it, however. For starters, Haunted House is a very early example of a horror-themed game, though not the first on home consoles. That honor actually belongs to the original Magnavox Odyssey, which had a Haunted House game played with cards and a screen overlay. There's also materials held at the College of New Jersey and the Hagley Museum and Library that suggest that RCA had plans for a Haunted House-themed game for the Fred microcomputer, which served as a prototype for the 1802 microprocessor, and with it, the Studio 2 console. As far as programmable released games, however, Haunted House made it out before anything else with a similar horror concept, though in its development period this was a bit less explicit. Haunted House went through a number of different names before release. The beta version's board is labeled as Mystery Mansion, and a Lab Loner label indicates that at one point it was alternatively known as Graves Manor, a name that it seems to have been advertised under before release. The game itself tasks players with entering an abandoned, decaying mansion set in the town of Spirit Bay, which is haunted by the spirit of its previous owner, the misanthropic Zachary Graves. The player must find the 3 pieces of a broken magic urn, an heirloom of the town's founding, and escape without being scared to death. Much of this narrative comes from the manual, but even the preliminary instructions indicate that the concept of finding the urn while avoiding monsters were there early on. Given that this 4-story mansion is long abandoned, the player must rely on an unlimited supply of matches to find their way around and see objects. On game modes 3 through 9, some doors are locked and require either the master key to get through, or for the player to use other staircases to get around them. If the player is touched by an enemy, represented by a spider, a bat, or the ghost of Graves himself, you lose one of your 9 lives. There is a scepter in the mansion that the manual suggests was carried by Graves to ward off evil spirits. And indeed, holding it here makes you invincible to the bat and the spider, and in most game modes, the ghost as well. Since you can only hold one item at a time, however, inevitably you will need to drop the scepter to pick up urn pieces or the master key. In these cases, your only option is to run from your foes. You'll know they're coming close to you when they appear on the screen accompanied by a howling wind sound and your match going out. The game modes adjust how many spiders wander the mansion, the walls are lit up, whether or not there are locked doors, if the ghost can be warded off with the scepter, enemy speeds, and if enemies will chase you from room to room. The difficulty switch adjusts whether or not lightning will light up the mansion's walls when enemies are on screen to help you find your way out of the room you're in. Your final score, which the game does not give you but is suggested in the manual, is based on the number of lives remaining and how many matches you used. As an added bonus, this game does have a black and white mode, which can no longer be counted as a standard on VCS releases. Given the theme of the game, having it as an option can really be an aesthetic choice as much as one addressing folks playing on a black and white set. The first two difficulty levels are pretty non-threatening. With no locked doors, you could pretty much just power through each room looking for the urn pieces or the scepter. And while enemies will spawn, they can't follow you through the closed doors, so you don't really have to worry about getting trapped. The biggest threat really is an enemy appearing right on the other side of a door when you open it. Game 3 is where things get interesting, as the locked doors turn the entire mansion into a maze, one where enemies can pin you down in a corner you can't easily escape from. Game 3 leaves the master key in the starting room, but no other game mode is so generous, and its utility is essentially limited to helping you map out where the other objects are, since you can't carry two things at once. Things get increasingly difficult from there, with 3 spiders in Game 5 on up, and the enemies being able to pass through doors in Game 6, though only the ghost can ignore locked doors. This makes it incredibly difficult to escape enemies chasing after you, and coupled with the issue of enemies catching you right as you open a door, you can burn through your lives pretty quickly. Game 7 introduces a mechanic from Adventure. If it touches you, the bad enemy will now steal any item you're holding and place it somewhere else in the mansion, which is incredibly aggravating when you've got an assembled urn and are just trying to make it to the exit. Game 8 speeds up all the enemies, and Game 9 allows all enemies to pass through locked doors, as well as changing the overall layout of the mansion from the one used in Games 3 through 8. Once you have the assembled urn, you have to make it back to where you came into the mansion, and a successful escape sees the VCS play a little rendition of the Twilight Zone theme song. All of these options allow you to pretty well tailor Haunted House to the amount of familiarity you have with the game. Once you understand the layout used in most of the game modes, it's a bit easier to navigate around and find the items you need to win, though the enemies do have a tendency to show up at inopportune moments. The fact that enemies also knock out your match provides an incentive to revisit a room that had one of them in it, since without your match you can't see any items that you may need. The scepter allows safe passage for the most part, and is an extremely useful tool for mapping out a pathway and to find where urn pieces are located in the higher difficulties that have more enemies, if you can track it down. It's a smartly designed game, and the moodiness provided by the sparse visuals and unsettling noises makes it kind of stressful in a way that a good horror game manages. Interestingly, the beta version of the game has a myriad of changes from what actually shipped out in February. Andreasen appears to have pulled directly from Superman at this earlier stage, with a timer keeping track of how quickly the player finishes the game by the minute. Whatever your final time is represents your score. There are a variety of other tweaks that fundamentally change how Haunted House is played, too. For one, players have a finite number of matches, each of which has a set length of time before they burn out. Enemies other than the ghost can only be seen while in the match's light, but only the ghost will actively try to touch you. That said, the wind noises will begin when you're in the same room as an enemy, and that starts an invisible timer until your character gets scared to death that ticks down faster while the enemy in question is visible in the match's light. This makes it more difficult to die, as you have quite a while to be in a room before your character begins to slow down and lose a life. The difficulty switch here adjusts whether or not the match is blown out when a monster enters the same room as the player. Other changes include the scepter being replaced with a cross graphic, randomized stares in some game types, a lack of footstep sounds, and the addition of a heartbeat sound that quickens as the character starts to get scared. The lack of footsteps and staircase sounds makes this game seem far too silent, so those additions were smart, though the heartbeat is a very nice touch that was unfortunate to lose. It appears that the feedback from this playtest dramatically shifted how Haunted House works, making it less about resource management and speedrunning, and more about avoiding dangers in the mansion as you find your way around. While Andreasen isn't available to discuss the connection to Adventure and Superman, the preliminary instructions shared with consumer playtesters make clear Atari's intentions. The comment sheet asks if players are familiar with Adventure and Superman, and their level of interest in maze games. At the time this was in development, maze games at home would have largely consisted of titles like Slot Racers, where players are fighting in a maze, or Maze Craze, where players are escaping a maze. At the same time, this beta is dated August 2nd, 1981, which would have put it smack dab in the middle of Pac-Man mania in the coin-op space. So it's plausible that Pac-Man was a factor on the game's development just as Adventure and Superman seem to be. Certainly, the final game's emphasis on avoiding enemies touching you bears out that connection to Pac-Man, as does navigating the maze of locked doors. Much of the coverage of Haunted House in its day focused on its status as a spiritual successor to Adventure and Superman, following its debut at the Winter CES show in 1982. That said, there are a few reviews recorded for the game. The July 1982 issue of Electronic Games gave the game a nice spread over 2 pages, noting that it should appeal to the same crowd who enjoyed Adventure while praising its audio-visual components and moodiness. On the flip side, they found scoring to be a bit fuzzy, noting that the real challenge is just finishing the game in a timely fashion. A blurb in the June 1983 edition of the magazine adds that the effect of creeping through dark rooms is very well done. TV Gamer found Haunted House to be a bit disappointing compared to Adventure, while Video Games said that it is a game of memory and logic, albeit one that's hard to get excited about, given that most of it takes place in the dark. The UK Computer and Video Games magazine wrote about how interesting it is to see an adventure game that is graphically driven rather than being text-based, though the specifics of the game seem to be very off the mark in their description. From Atari's internal sales documentation that is available, it is hard to say how well Haunted House did on the market. Much as Superman and Adventure, it doesn't show up on the pages of the sales memo that appeared in Once Upon Atari, which suggests that it was not one of Atari's top-selling games. The game does show up in the internal 1986 through 1990 sales files rescued by the late Kurt Vendel, which indicate Atari sold 34,641 copies in that time frame, almost entirely in 1988. This is far more than the roughly 9,000 copies of Adventure Atari sold in the same time frame, which suggests that Haunted House was seen as a more unique, engaging, and exciting experience. More importantly, one that people would buy. Haunted House ushered in a fresh resurgence of adventure-style games for the VCS. The Sword Quest series, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and E.T. the Extraterrestrial are all built from the same adventure concept scaffolding that Haunted House stems from. Third-party games like Imagic's Fathom were similarly ambitious, albeit with more separation than what Atari was doing in-house. And other platforms saw their own variations on console adventure games, from Mattel Electronics' Dungeons & Dragons games on the Intellivision to Quest for the Rings on the Odyssey 2. Nor would Haunted House be the last horror-themed console game of this era. Titles such as Data Age's Frankenstein's Monster, Wavemaker's Dungeons of Dracula, Imagic's Intellivision game Dracula, or arguably CBS's Mountain King, ensured that there was some spookiness on the market over the next couple years. Haunted House has, in the decades since, become one of the games synonymous with the VCS, even if it wasn't a huge seller, to the point where the recent Atari 50 collection includes a 3D remake of the game. A sequel, Return to Haunted House, was released in 2004 on the Flashback 2 console, though this has much more in common with Adventure than Haunted House. As mentioned previously, after Haunted House, Andreasen was moved over to developing games for the Atari 5200, putting together its version of Pac-Man and Real Sports Baseball. He also appears to have worked with a graphics artist, Alan Murphy, on Quagmire, an unreleased 5200 game. After Jack Trammell purchased Atari's consumer division assets in 1984, Andreasen joined up with Jim Huether and Eric Mangies to form Advantage Software, which briefly tried to sell edutainment software for the Commodore 64. When none of the major publishers took up their games due to the home computer market struggling around 1985, Advantage shuttered and the trio left for other pastures. According to Andreasen's obituary, he continued to work in cutting-edge technology and pioneered work on multi-screen displays. Haunted House is among the best adventure-style and horror games on the VCS platform, and is a superb example of how even the limited graphics and sound capabilities of the VCS can be utilized to make something moody and effective. While it may not be strictly scary, that particular kind of stress good horror provides can be found right here in Graves Manor. Next time, ghosts are still chasing you in a maze.